Alright guys, let's get started with our very last lecture for this unit. I know it's been a long one, but thanks for sticking in there. Today we're going to talk about biodiversity and conservation. So this one definitely takes everything we've learned this unit, kind of brings it all together. So let's jump in. Now, biodiversity is a term that's defined as the variety of life in an area determined by the number of species in that area. So biodiversity is essentially how much life there is, how many different species of life in a given area. The more species, the more biodiverse your ecosystem is. Biodiversity is an incredibly good thing. It makes your ecosystem stable, it makes it healthier, because the more species you have and the more of that species, the more you're going to be able to withstand any dramatic changes to your environment. The more your species are going to be healthy and they can breed and not have genetic diseases, things like that. So there's three main types of biodiversity that we're going to focus on: genetic, species, and ecosystem diversity. Genetic diversity is really fascinating. It's probably the one that we're going to talk about the most long-term in this class. It's defined as the variety of the genes, or DNA, the inheritable characteristics present within a specific population. The more genes that you have, the more diverse your genes, the more traits you can pass on to your offspring. So humans are an incredibly genetic diverse species. We have different hair colors, eye colors, skin colors, not to mention all the other minor things that you don't see that affect who you are. So this is the diversity that we're talking about when we say genetic, what's inherent inside your DNA that you can pass on. So if you look at our example pictures on the left, look at all the different varieties of corn that you can possibly have. So all of those show that corn is a genetically diverse species. It has high genetic diversity. Dogs are another species with incredibly high genetic diversity. You can have little tiny chihuahuas, and then you can have Great Danes, and dogs can have every color, every size, every hair texture in between. The bottom one is a bunch of different potatoes and all their different shapes, sizes, colors, and textures. So the more genetic diversity you have, the more chances that your species are going to be able to survive. Because if I have different traits that allow me to withstand a disease or survive better in a colder environment, then if my environment were to suddenly change, I would still be okay. I'd be able to pass those genes on and keep my species alive. Now, something very interesting, a species that we all really love is probably cheetahs. Cheetahs have incredibly low genetic diversity. After the last ice age, they never really bounced back properly. So even if we could breed them out of their endangered state, their genetics are so weak at this point, they have so few genes for us to pick from, that they'd probably end up dying if there was ever some major change to the environment. Or even they may struggle because they're going to start having interbreeding problems where their genetics starts messing up their health because they're so closely related to each other. The second type of diversity is species diversity. This is defined as the number of different species and how many of each species there are in a community. So genetic diversity was really focusing on population. This is focusing on community levels. So a high diversity does not just mean I have many different species, because we can look at this picture on the bottom right here, and I can have 1 species elephant, 2 is the lion, 3 giraffe, 4 the kudu, 5 hippo, and 6 some type of wild dog or wolf. So I have 5 species in both of these actually, but the problem is this one I only have 2 lions, 2 giraffes, 1 hippo. I have tons of elephants. So what you're looking at is very low diversity for certain species and high diversity for others. So what we really want is this community over here, because it has a more equal distribution of all the different species. So we still have 5 species, but we have more of every type rather than having an ecosystem dominated by just one type. Same thing with this picture above. I know it's a little hard to see, but in this picture, we mostly have pine trees. Even though all the other trees that are in this picture are present, we have mostly one type of tree on the left. On the right, it's more of an even or equal distribution. That is what we want. We want that high species diversity in many ways. So species diversity tends to increase the closer you get to the equator because there's more resources available there. Remember in class when we talked about the biomes, we mentioned that near the equator you have more stable temperatures. They're going to be fairly warm all year round. There's going to be a much higher rainfall. You get the same amount of sunlight every day. So because of that, it allows many plants to live there, and it allows significantly more nutrients and more water for animals and plants to use. The closer you get to the poles, that's not the case. Think of Alaska. It's very cold. There's going to be very little rainfall depending on the time of year. And the sunlight levels change drastically, so certain plants won't be able to tolerate that. The final type of diversity is ecosystem diversity. This is the variety of different ecosystems present in the entire biosphere. So how many ecosystems do we find across the Earth? And ecosystems, like I said, can be varying sizes. They can be as small as the area underneath a rock or inside a log, or they can be a larger area like the savanna as a whole. So ecosystem diversity is really affected by the health of the area, the biotic factors, things like your climate, and then the interactions between your living things as well. Now, I want you guys to write down the answer to this question before we discuss it. So you can pause the video, write the answer, and then move on. The question is, why does biodiversity matter? Whether that's genetic diversity, ecosystem diversity, or species diversity, why is it important? Write down what you think the answer is, and then we'll move on. So why does biodiversity matter? Well, mostly, if we ask someone that question, there's a very personal answer that's given. We usually like to see the animals. We usually enjoy nature for people who want to protect biodiversity. But there's more than just personal or emotional issues when it comes to conserving and protecting the Earth. There are very logical reasons, such as economic value, aesthetic value, and scientific value. So let's discuss these one at a time. So direct economic value. We actually depend on so many plants and animals across the world for things like medicine, for food, for shelter. We have such a monetary value attributed to every single species on this planet. If we lose those species, or if we lose diversity in general, we're losing those benefits that we get. Things like aspirin, salicylic acid, that came from the bark of the willow tree. The Native Americans found that out, and they used it to stop pain. So if we were to have lost all the willows, where would we have gotten aspirin from and these other medications? There's back in the early history of the United States, there was a big disease that came through and wiped out all of the American chestnut trees. They're now an extinct species. What could we have possibly gotten beneficially from those plants if they hadn't been wiped out? We also use plants and animals for food crops. So think about seeds for our plants. Some of them are so genetically identical across the entire world, like corn. There's one species of corn that can be done all over the planet, planted all over the planet, and it has the same DNA. If one disease were to hit the world that hit that type of DNA where it was vulnerable, we would lose all of that crop. We'd lose all of our corn. So it's really important to increase that genetic diversity so we don't end up losing our crops. One really interesting thing that we've been doing to try to prevent this is the global seed vault in Svalbard, Norway. So this is a picture of it right here. You enter through the door there. It's basically this frozen storage area. We take seeds from all over the world. There's countries and countries of seeds worth in this vault, and it's just a way of protecting it in case something were to happen. That way we have that genetic information in case there's ever some type of natural disaster. There's also indirect economic value, things that are really important to us but we can't exactly put a cost on. So things like plants removing the CO2 from the atmosphere, giving us oxygen. We can't put an economic value on being able to breathe, but we know it's incredibly important. Another example is tree roots. So the more trees there are, the more that their roots dig deep into the soil and prevent erosion. This can protect many cities from things like flooding and mudslides. One thing that we don't consider when we're building our cities and we're building our roads is that all that land area that we've now covered prevents rainwater from being soaked up by the earth and going into what we call groundwater or aquifer storage areas. We use these areas of water storage for things like drinking water or irrigating our crops. The more that we direct all of this water out to the ocean rather than letting it get soaked up by the earth, we're going to be losing it. So we won't have that fresh water available to us in the future. There's also aesthetic value. So aesthetic is a visual thing. Our world is incredibly beautiful. It's in our interest to keep it that way. It's nice to see beauty all around us, but it's also important because we found that spending time out in nature and seeing that beauty reduces your stress level. It can even improve your health, and it's even known to reduce symptoms of ADHD. Another reason is we use it for recreation. People go swimming and boating and hiking. Losing biodiversity can mean losing some of these pastimes and these recreation things that we love. Another thing is scientific value. Scientists love to study everything, and it's not always just a waste of time. Often studying the smallest thing about our world can lead to incredible benefits in our knowledge about humanity and the world in general, so we can improve it. Now, even though we want to increase and protect biodiversity, there's always going to be threats to it. So some of these threats can be natural. They're just part of being on the earth, and some can be what we call anthropogenic or man-made. So these could be overexploitation, habitat loss and destruction, fragmentation and edge effects, extinction, pollution, and invasive species. So let's talk about each of those one at a time. Extinction. A lot of you guys are very familiar with this term. It just refers to when the very last member of a species dies or is no longer found in the biosphere. We've kind of expanded that definition a little bit. There may be some species left over, like the white rhino. There's a very few left in the world, but we still call them extinct because they just don't have enough genetic diversity in their numbers to be able to create a healthy population anymore. So they'll never bounce back. So this can be natural or it can be human-driven. Some examples of extinct species are the dodo, everyone knows that one, the woolly mammoth, the passenger pigeon, and this really cool animal here on the bottom called the thylacine or the Tasmanian tiger. So its extinction was caused by an invasive species called the dingo being introduced into Australia and those areas of the world. And because they were in competition and they were being hunted by the Aboriginal humans. The very last thylacine was in a zoo. His name was Benjamin, and he died in 1936, so this was a very recent loss. These are really cool species if you ever want to go check them out. They look like dogs, but they're actually marsupials, like the possum and the kangaroo. They have a pouch to carry their young in, so they're a little bit different from normal mammals. Overexploitation is something that, unfortunately, humans do pretty well. We tend to find species that serve us very well or that we like, and then we overuse them. We kill them too much. So we might be using them for food. We might be using them for their body parts like their fur. Or even pets. There's an exotic pet trade where people who think, oh, that animal's really cute, I want it. Well, people will go and steal those animals from the wild in order for you to have it as a pet. An example's monkeys. Oftentimes these monkeys are kidnapped from the wild. The poachers who collect them will often destroy their habitat in the process. And as a result, they're kept in horrible conditions and transported around the world so they can be sold for for good cost, and they make a good profit on them. Now, plants are even overexploited. They can be very useful, they can be rare, they can be very beautiful, like orchids. One major example from the United States is the buffalo, or the bison. When people first started going west and they found the bison, they thought, what a great crop. It's a naturally growing animal in this area that's so plentiful we can use it for food. Because bison meat is pretty good and it tastes kind of like a steak. So the Native Americans had learned a way to hunt them in a proper way that maintained their numbers so they never went extinct. But when Western hunters started coming across from the East Coast, they started to overhunt them and overuse them. So this picture right here is actually, these two men are standing on and next to a pile of bones. All of those are skulls, just the skull, not the full skeleton of the bison. So that's an incredible amount of bison that they killed in a very short time, and they almost drove the bison to extinction, but their numbers have since bounced back because we've been protecting them. Another threat is to the habitat itself. Often the habitat is completely lost or destroyed. This is actually the main reason behind why species go extinct. Habitat destruction is caused by things like deforestation, fire damage, flooding. So it's not always human caused, it can be natural as well. But when we talk about habitat destruction, it may not always mean destroying the landscape. It could also mean affecting the balance of species. If you overfish a certain species and it turns out that that fish was a keystone species, remember we talked about those in class, they're the really important species that kind of bind the ecosystem together and keep it healthy. If you end up destroying a keystone species, you put that ecosystem into complete disarray, into chaos, and you can end up losing all the species in that ecosystem. Think back to what we talked about with the sea otter and the sea urchin and the kelp and the elephants. Now, tied into habitats here is something called habitat fragmentation. So sometimes we don't destroy the habitat. Sometimes we just accidentally split it in two. So this is usually caused by humans, and it's because we put in obstacles like a bridge or a road or a city. And this prevents natural living conditions for these animals. So if you look at this picture over here, this is what the habitat looked like originally. Then we put a road right through it. So now you have a significantly smaller area for all these animals to live in. You can split up groups of animals so that way they can't mate properly anymore. You can separate an organism from its ability to migrate properly. It also leads to something called edge effects. So if you look on this original picture, there's two different colors for the environment. On the edges, there's a lot of other factors that come into play. The abiotic and biotic factors become different. Things like light changes, wind changes, the amount of predators, even sometimes what's inside the soil can change here. So not every species can live near the edge of a habitat. Many can only live in the center part of the habitat. So the smaller and the smaller you fragment these habitats, the smaller the living area is for these species and the more edge area that we have. So some species will end up going extinct. Other species tend to thrive in these areas. Think of like raccoons. And so they're the ones that end up having huge explosions in their numbers. Next is pollution. That's a really big threat to the environment. We're going to talk about two in particular because you guys probably know a lot about pollution. One is acid rain. So with acid rain, you think, oh, well, it's just going to destroy our buildings and things like that. But it also takes the calcium and the potassium and other nutrients that are in the soil, it takes them away. So plants and animals can't use them anymore, and it kind of starves them for nutrients. It lowers the carrying capacity for that environment. Now, the next one that you've probably never heard of is something called eutrophication. So we use a lot of fertilizers when we're growing our crops and even in our personal lives. And these are very, very high in nitrogen. Remember, plants need nitrogen to grow. That's why we add it with a fertilizer. So when eutrophication happens, what's going on is that all of this fertilizer tends to get caught up in rainwater, and it washes away, and it ends up going into a body of water like a pond or a lake. When this happens, all that nitrogen causes a large population explosion of things like algae and plankton. And all of these things, as they grow very, very quickly in number, will use up all the oxygen inside the small lake or pond. Once all that oxygen gets used up, the species that normally live there, like the fish, they can't get any more oxygen, and so you have massive die-offs of species, and it can end up taking a pond and completely destroying all life in that pond. So it's a pretty big problem that we're dealing with right now. The last threat are invasive species. These are non-native species. So a native species would be something that is from a particular area. Like, for example, a non-native species to California would be something like a gorilla. Gorillas are not naturally found here, but we do have native rattlesnakes and coyotes. So an invasive species is a non-native one that gets moved from their home into a completely different ecosystem. Often they end up having no natural predators like the rabbits in Australia, and so this causes a huge explosion in their population, and they end up overusing all the resources, and the entire ecosystem falls apart. So some invasive species that we're dealing with right now in America are the zebra mussels. If you've ever gone on a boat here in California, you often have to get checked for zebra mussels, and you have to pass an inspection. Fire ants are also not native to the United States. They came to us from Argentina, and now they've actually spread to more parts around the world. The plant kudzu I talked about before, there's the Asian carp, and then of course the rabbits in Australia. So what can we do to protect our biodiversity? Obviously, it's pretty important that we do protect it. There's a few things we can do. First, we can manage our resources properly. We can reduce waste. Essentially, don't waste your resources. Use them for when you need them, because you don't know who you're taking that resource away from. We can create things like corridors for animals to pass between fragmented areas. So if you have a freeway right here, and you have a bunch of trees for a forest on one side, and then you've split them up from the forest on the other side, what people are doing now is creating a special bridge that has shrubs and grass and things like that on it, so plants and animals can pass back and forth. We can monitor species. We can do something called bioremediation, where we use living species like fungus and bacteria to remove pollution from the environment. We can protect land by creating national parks, or a lot of places do game reserves where animals can live in their natural habitat. They just have a fence around the greater area so they can't get out. You can do biological augmentation. What this is what reintroducing a predator to control the prey populations, like the wolves in Yellowstone. One interesting one is hunting. This might seem contradicting. How can you save a species by hunting them? Well, oftentimes with big species like lions and elephants and rhinos, if you make a hunter pay for a hunting license, and you make them pay a lot of money, sometimes upward of $50,000 just to hunt one old animal that's about to die anyway, or it can't breed anymore, all that money can go back into conservation. So this is done a lot out in Africa. Then there's legal protection. You can pass laws that can prevent people from killing or harming animals. And the most important one is to educate people. The more people know about their environment and how important it is, the more they're going to want to protect it. All right, so that is our entire video. So in summary, we talked about biodiversity, the 3 different types, and how we want to have more biodiversity in our ecosystem because it keeps the ecosystem healthy. We talked about many of the threats to biodiversity, and finally we talked about some ways that we can conserve or protect it. If you guys have any questions, write them down and ask next class. Be sure to remember to do the vocab assignment. Double check the website because I'm going to be posting a revised vocab assignment. I'm taking many of the words off to make it shorter for you guys. All right, have a good day.